Careful you don't break it. Leave the big guns to the pilots." The laughter echoed through the hangar, but she kept working, hands steady on the Apache's cannon. Then the pilot walked in, smirk fading as his eyes locked on her sleeve, red and black. The forbidden patch no one was meant to see. She didn't flinch. She locked the cannon, stepped into the rotor wash, and told a man twice her rank to move. The radio exploded. An armed gunship was in free fall, seconds from tearing itself apart. A minute ago they mocked her. Now every gaze clung to the woman they couldn't explain. This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week, like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The clang of metal against metal carried through the cavernous hangar, a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. Somewhere above, fluorescent tubes hummed, washing everything in a pale light that made steel glisten like ice. The air smelled faintly of jet fuel and hot oil, the perfume of a place where machines outweighed men. At the far end of the bay, a lone figure knelt beside the squat nose of an R-64 Apache, her hands moving with quiet precision. She wore no pilot's wings, no rank bars, just a grey workshirt rolled to the elbows and trousers streaked with the ghosts of old Greece. A small group of young mechanics lingered by the tool carts, half working, half watching her. One, barely out of flight school by the look of him, cupped his hands around his mouth. "Careful you don't break it. Leave the big guns to the pilots," he called, and the others snickered. Another added, "She's probably never even seen it fire." The laughter was quick, nervous, bouncing off the high walls like loose shell casings. She didn't rise to it. Her gaze stayed fixed on the task in front of her, fingertips sliding a calibration gauge into place. Every movement was deliberate, measured not in seconds but in the satisfaction of getting it exactly right. A faint click answered her effort, the kind of sound only someone who lived in the guts of these machines would recognize as a victory. The others drifted back to their work, muttering under their breath. But the echo of that mockery still hung in the air when a new set of footsteps crossed the concrete. The man who entered didn't belong to the line crew. His flight suit was dark green, still dusty from the field, and the nameplate above his chest was scuffed from years in service. His eyes, sharp, scanning, moved over the rows of aircraft until they found her. He slowed, a faint smirk forming, as if he'd just spotted the source of the earlier laughter. He took in the sight of her crouched over the cannon housing, forearms taut with effort, and began to step closer. Whatever he intended to say was caught mid-breath when she shifted slightly, the sleeve of her shirt catching the overhead light. There, half hidden in the fold of fabric, was a patch. Not a bright, polished squadron crest, but an old thing, its threads dulled with time, red and black, the colors deep as dried blood and storm clouds. The design was simple, a raven's wing across a broken sword, but it was enough to stop him cold. His smirk vanished. In its place came a focus that felt heavier than the air between them. He closed the distance in 3 long strides, his boots striking the floor with a muted finality. The low murmur of conversation elsewhere in the hangar faded as he came to stand just off her shoulder. "Where did you get that?" His voice was low but not soft, each word carved clean and deliberate. She straightened slowly, setting the tool aside without haste, and glanced at him. Her eyes didn't widen, didn't flicker with surprise. They simply met his, steady and unreadable, before she looked back to the weapon. "I asked you a question," he pressed, the timbre in his voice hardening. The noise of a ratchet being used somewhere nearby died away. Heads turned. 2 deckhands carrying hydraulic lines slowed to a stop, curiosity pulling them into the moment. The space between her and the pilot had become a fault line, invisible but undeniable. From the corner of the hangar, a figure in a dark uniform approached, a senior officer by the weight of the gold stitched on his epaulets. His gait was brisk, his expression carved from stone. "Something wrong here, Captain?" he asked, his eyes flicking between the two. The pilot didn't look away from her. That insignia, Raven Squadron. A ripple moved through the onlookers. The name wasn't shouted, but it might as well have been. For most, it was just a whisper from old war stories, a unit that existed. In the shadows, one you didn't ask too many questions about. For a few it was something else, something that pulled at the edges of memory like a half-healed scar. The officer's gaze dropped to her arm, narrowing as he took in the faded threads. He said nothing, but his attention sharpened, as if measuring her in ways the others couldn't see. She tightened the last bolt on the cannon's access panel and rose to her feet. Taller than she looked from a crouch, she carried herself with an economy of motion that hinted at training well beyond the workshop. "You don't wear that unless you earned it," the pilot said, more to the room than to her. If his words were meant to push her into explaining, they failed. She wiped her hands on a rag, folded it, and set it on the edge of the tool cart. Not once did she break the evenness of her breathing. The officer stepped in, his voice quieter but edged with authority. "Name?" She gave it, short, clipped, nothing more than the syllables required. "Run it," he told a nearby crewman. The man hurried to the workstation in the corner, fingers tapping rapidly across the keyboard. The sound of the keys seemed loud in the pause that followed. After a moment, the crewman hesitated. "Sir, I've got her current assignment maintenance logs, but nothing before 2 years ago. No training records, no enlistment data. It's like—" He stopped himself, glancing toward her. "It's like the rest was scrubbed." The pilot finished for him, his gaze never leaving her face. Her eyes lifted to meet his again, calm as still water. If there was any reaction to the tightening circle of attention around her, it was buried deep. The officer studied her a long beat, then said, "You've been holding out on us." She didn't answer. Instead, she reached for the cannon's safety cover, latching it shut with a decisive click. The sound was crisp, final, and for some reason it made the back of the pilot's neck prickle. Around them, the hangar seemed to draw in a collective breath. The usual backdrop, air compressors kicking on, distant shouts from the flight line, faded beneath the weight of whatever this was turning into. A few of the younger mechanics shifted uncomfortably, sensing that the joke they'd made earlier had just walked into territory they didn't understand. The officer's voice cut through the tension. "Captain, with me, you—" He nodded at her. "Stay put." But she didn't stay put. She moved past both men. Not in defiance, but in a way that said she was done being examined like a relic in a display case. Her boots made no more noise than a whisper on the concrete, yet every step carried an unspoken challenge. If you want answers, you're going to have to work for them. She stopped at the bench where her tools were laid out in neat rows, each one exactly where it belonged. Sliding her hands into a pair of gloves, she began sorting through them, not hurried, not delaying, just moving at the same deliberate pace she'd had from the start. The officer and the pilot exchanged a glance, something passing between them without words. Then the officer turned on his heel and walked toward the far end of the hangar, his shadow stretching long under the overhead lights. The pilot stayed where he was, watching her like a man who'd stumbled onto a story bigger than he'd been told. Somewhere in the distance, a forklift beeped in reverse. The moment felt suspended, the world beyond the hangar walls shrinking to the square of space between them. He took a breath, about to speak again, and that's when the first sharp crackle of the radio shattered the air. The crackle on the comms was jagged and loud, like lightning splitting the air inside the hangar. It wasn't the casual chatter of a routine flight. It carried the clipped urgency of a voice under pressure. Tower to maintenance, tower to operations. Be advised, gunship 2-1 declaring in flight emergency. Repeat, gunship 2-1 in flight emergency. Heads turned. Every mechanic, every crew chief in earshot froze with whatever they had in their hands. The forklift in the corner stopped mid-beep, the driver staring over the wheel. A follow-up transmission cut in before anyone could move. Main weapons system failure. Secondary hydraulics unstable. Pilot reports partial control loss. Estimated 2 minutes to critical descent. The officer who'd been questioning her moments earlier spun toward the radio set at the far wall. "Patch me through to the cockpit," he barked. A tech scrambled to comply, flipping switches and turning dials until the channel opened. "This is Major Keating. Gunship 2-1, do you copy?" A thin veil of static hissed before a strained voice replied, "Copy, Major." "I'm fighting the cyclic. She's wanting to roll left hard." Weapons bay doors jammed open, hydraulics in the red. "I've got..." The transmission cut for half a second, then came back with a heavy breath. "I've got maybe a minute before I lose full control." The Major's jaw tightened. "Understood. Hold your current heading if you can. We're working on a solution." He turned sharply, scanning the hangar. Most of the flight crew capable of taking up an emergency launch were already out on sorties or away from base. The only operational Apache here was the one sitting under the lights. Its cannon freshly serviced, systems rechecked, fuel topped off. His eyes landed on her. She hadn't moved since the first call came in. She stood beside the aircraft, gloved hands resting lightly against the nose as if she could feel the machine's pulse through the armor plating. The pilot from earlier stepped forward. "Major, we can take this one. She's hot and ready." The Major hesitated. I'm suggesting," the pilot cut in. "We've got maybe 90 seconds before that bird augers in. You've got no other airframes prepped, no other gunners on deck. Unless you want to watch Gunship 2-1 hit the dirt, we move now." The Major's gaze flicked to her again, weighing something invisible. "You up for this?" he asked. She met his stare without blinking. "Tell me where you want me." It was all the confirmation he needed. "Get her in the front seat. Captain, you fly!" That set the hangar in motion like a switch had been thrown. Ground crew hustled to pull the chocks, disconnect the shore power, and roll the auxiliary cart away. The thrum of activity was undercut by the whine of the Apu kicking over, the first breath of the machine awakening. She climbed the ladder into the gunner's station, the movement smooth and practiced. No hesitation, no fumbling with unfamiliar straps, just a clean slide into position. She adjusted the harness in 2 pulls, settling the buckles snug across her shoulders and hips. The pilot swung into the rear cockpit, running through startup checks so fast his voice was almost a blur over the intercom. Power up, rotors engaged, fuel feed green, all systems nominal. Above them, the blades began their slow, heavy churn, each rotation pulling more air into a growing storm. The smell of kerosene exhaust curled through the hangar, mixing with the tang of metal and grease. "Clear left, clear right," the pilot called, his voice tight with focus. The crew chief on the line gave a sharp hand signal and stepped back. The Apache edged forward, wheels rolling over the painted deck lines, then turned toward the yawning mouth of the hangar. The moment they crossed the threshold, the daylight hit her face, bright, sharp, reflecting off her visor. The rush of open air slammed into the cockpit, carrying the scent of dust and sun-baked concrete. "Tower, "This is Gunship 1-3, lifting to intercept Gunship 2-1, the pilot reported as he eased the collective. The helicopter rose, skids leaving the ground with the steadiness of a lifter under control. She scanned the horizon, eyes flicking over the terrain and the distant glint of the crippled Apache. Over the intercom, the stricken pilot's voice was back, tighter now. 1-3, I've got no joy on stabilizing the bay doors. Feels like I'm dragging an anchor on the left side. Hydraulics dropping. Her hands moved over the weapon controls, powering up the targeting. Systems not to fire, but to free the jammed mechanisms if possible. She could hear the whine and click of servos responding, the faint vibration through the frame as the mount shifted. "You're pitching left because your drag's uneven," she said into the comm, her tone level, as though explaining a drill. "I'm going to try to cycle your weapons bay from here. Stand by." The pilot in her own bird glanced forward. "Can you even do that remotely?" She didn't answer. Her fingers danced across the controls, initiating a maintenance override, sequence that bypassed the damaged actuator on the other aircraft. The system groaned in protest, metal straining against its own damage. On the horizon, the bay door of 2-1 twitched, then shuddered, fully closed. Doors sealed. The pilot of the stricken bird reported, disbelief in his voice. "Roll stabilizing. I can actually—" "You're still heavy on the port side," she cut in, "but you can make the runway. Keep your nose 5 degrees right and let the trim do the rest." The Major's voice came over the open channel from the tower. 1-3, escort her home. Keep her in your sight the whole way. "Copy," her pilot replied. The two helicopters angled back toward the airfield. The sun caught their rotors, flashing silver arcs against the blue. From her vantage in the front seat, she could see ground crews already racing. To the far end of the tarmac, fire trucks in tow, foam cannons ready. As they descended, the damaged Apache wobbled but held its line, skids kissing the runway in a puff of dust and smoke. It rolled to a stop, the rotor still chopping the air but no longer in danger of folding into the earth. Her own pilot flared and sat down beside it, the skids clanging gently onto the concrete. She powered down the systems, fingers moving with the same deliberate care she'd shown on the hangar floor. When the canopy opened, the noise of the rotors became a hurricane again. She climbed down first, boots hitting the ground with the weight of someone who'd been here before. The airfield crew stared, half in relief, half in the kind of curiosity that can't be helped when you've just seen something you weren't expecting. The rescued pilot stepped out of his cockpit, helmet tucked under one arm. His expression was part gratitude, part confusion. "Who the hell are you?" he asked, loud enough for more than a few to hear. She didn't answer him either. She just walked back toward the hangar, gloves still on, visor down against the glare. The crowd parted without being asked. Inside, the Major and the original pilot were waiting. Neither spoke as she approached. The only sound was the fading thump of the rotors outside. She stopped a few feet away, her shadow falling across them. The Major's eyes held the weight of questions he knew wouldn't get answers, not here, not now. "Good work," he said finally. She stripped off her gloves and set them on the workbench. "The gun's ready for the next op," she replied, as if nothing else had happened. But in the charged quiet that followed, every person in that hangar knew something had shifted. The murmur began as soon as she stepped past the threshold of the hangar. It was low at first, a ripple in the background, but it traveled quickly. One voice leaning into another, half-formed sentences spilling into speculation. "She just closed it from here?" No way she knew that override without flying one. You saw how she strapped in, like it wasn't her first time. She moved through it, as if the words didn't touch her, heading for the workbench where her tools still lay in neat alignment. The dull thud of her boots on the concrete was steady, measured, a counterpoint to the restless shifting of the others. Major Keating remained by the far wall, one shoulder against a support beam, his gaze tracking her without giving away what he was thinking. He didn't miss much, never had, but the scene he'd just witnessed didn't fit into any of the boxes his training had prepared for. Beside him, Captain Rourke, the Apache pilot who had flown her out, stood with arms crossed, helmet still under one arm. His jaw worked, like he was chewing over a dozen questions and finding none of them easy to voice. The hangar crew avoided looking directly at her for too long, but their eyes kept drifting back, pulled by the same magnetic question: who was she really? She peeled off her flight harness, setting it on the bench with quiet precision, then slid into the process of wiping down the cannon's housing. It was as if the air outside hadn't been filled with the beat of rotor blades or the shadow of a gunship in trouble. Keating pushed off the beam and crossed to the corner where the comm station sat. He leaned toward the crewman who'd tried running her records earlier. "Try it again," he said, in a voice pitched low enough not to carry. The young specialist hesitated, then brought the system back online. His fingers tapped across the keys, pulling up the personnel interface. Name, assignment history, qualifications, same as before. The service record prior to 2 years ago was a blank stretch, as if someone had taken a blade to the archive. Keating's brow furrowed. "Check the off-network archive," he instructed. A few keystrokes later, the result was the same. No enlistment entry, no training cycle, no listed deployments. Only the tail end of a career that began in mystery. Rourke noticed the exchange. He stepped closer, his boots striking the floor with enough weight to draw eyes. "You won't find anything," he said. Keating glanced up. "You sound sure?" Rourke's expression was unreadable, but there was a hint of calculation there. "Because records like that don't disappear by accident." Across the hangar she kept working, the rhythm of her movements giving no indication she knew she was under scrutiny. But Rourke couldn't shake the memory of how her hands had moved over the cockpit controls, how she'd issued instructions to the stricken pilot with the calm cadence of someone who'd been under fire before. The conversations around them grew bolder now, volume rising in proportion to the distance from her. Could be she transferred from another branch, or Black Ops. Or maybe she just trained somewhere off the books. Rourke let the voices run in the background. He knew what the others didn't, that the insignia on her arm didn't belong to any conventional chain of command and was tied in whispers to missions that never made it into after-action reports. He finally stepped away from Keating and closed the distance between them. She glanced up when his shadow fell across the workbench. "Why didn't you say anything out there?" he asked, keeping his voice low enough that only she could hear. She set the cleaning cloth down, not hurrying the movement. Would it have made a difference? "It might have made me understand what I was dealing with," he countered. Her eyes met his, and for a moment the hangar seemed to fade around them. "You didn't need to understand, you just needed to fly." Before he could answer, Keating's voice cut in from behind. "Captain, with me." The Major's tone carried the weight of a man about to make a call that could reshape the next several hours. They stepped away toward the administrative offices that overlooked the hangar floor, leaving her with the tools and the low thrum of conversation. From above, Keating looked down through the glass at her solitary figure. "You've been in longer than me, Captain. Ever seen someone pull an override like that?" Rourke shook his head. "No one without a gunner's qualification, and even then not with that speed." Keating's gaze stayed fixed on her. "If she's what I think she is, we're not supposed to have her here, not without clearance from much higher than me." "What do you plan to do?" Rourke asked. The Major didn't answer right away. His eyes narrowed, the lines on his face deepening. "First, I want to see who else noticed that patch." Below, she finished the last of the post-maintenance work and stripped off her gloves, setting them in their exact place on the bench. She didn't look up at the office windows, but if she had, she might have seen both men watching her with the same intensity, though for different reasons. By the time she left the hangar, the speculation had mutated into something more dangerous, curiosity edged with fear. People had stopped speaking in full sentences when she walked by, but the silence was loaded with the weight of their questions. She crossed the tarmac toward the supply building, the wind tugging at her sleeves. The sun was dropping lower, casting long shadows that stretched like dark fingers across the pavement. Somewhere beyond the horizon, engines roared faintly, other birds returning from missions she wasn't briefed on and wouldn't be. Inside supply, the air was cooler, smelling faintly of canvas and oiled wood. She signed out a new set of calibration tools, the clerk behind the counter glancing once at her arm before looking away quickly. Word had traveled fast. When she returned to the hangar, Rourke was waiting. He didn't bother with small talk. "Major Keating's talking to command," he said. "Your name's going to be in more ears than you probably want." She set the tool case down. "Then maybe you should stop saying it." Rourke's mouth curved slightly, though it wasn't quite a smile. "You're not making this easy." "I'm not here to make anything easy," she said. He studied her for a long moment, then shifted the topic. "That override sequence, you improvised it. That's not standard procedure. It worked. That's not the point." "It's the only point," she replied, and turned back to the Apache as if the conversation were finished. Above, in the glass-fronted office, Keating hung up the secure line. His expression had shifted into something heavier, less like a man following orders, and more like one standing at the edge of a storm. "They're sending someone," he told Rourke when the captain stepped inside. "Who?" "Higher than either of us. They want to assess the situation." Rourke glanced down at her on the hangar floor. "They're coming for her, then." Keating didn't confirm or deny it, but the lack of answer said enough. The sound of rotors came first, low, distant, building in volume until the glass panes in the office began to tremble. Keating stepped to the window, his eyes narrowing against the afternoon glare. A 60 Black Hawks slid into view, banking toward the auxiliary landing pad adjacent to the main runway. Its matte paint absorbed the sunlight, and the markings were minimal. No unit insignia, no tail art, just a small alphanumeric code stenciled near the tail boom. Rourke joined him at the window. "Not standard transport for a goodwill visit," he observed. Keating didn't respond. He was already moving for the stairs, taking them two at a time. Rourke followed, neither man speaking, as they descended to the hangar floor. Outside, the Black Hawk skids touched down with a puff of dust. The side door slid open before the rotors had fully spun down, and a tall figure stepped out, the downdraft snapping the edge of his jacket against his legs. He wasn't in a flight suit. Instead, he wore a dark field coat with no name tape and no visible rank. A pair of mirrored glasses shielded his eyes, but not the weight of his attention as it swept the tarmac. She emerged from between the Apaches just as the newcomer's boots hit the ground. The wind from the rotors caught her hair where it had slipped from its tie, tugging a loose strand across her cheek. She didn't move to fix it. The man in the coat closed the distance quickly, his stride purposeful. Keating intercepted him halfway, offering a crisp nod. "Sir." The man didn't return the courtesy. "Where is she?" Keating stepped aside just enough for the line of sight to clear. "Over there by the bird you just saw on your way in." The stranger's gaze fixed on her like a targeting reticle. "You're coming with me." Her expression didn't change. On whose authority? On the authority of people you used to work for? Rourke moved in before she could answer. If you're here to pull her, I'd like to know why. The man's head turned slightly, the mirrored lenses reflecting the captain's face back at him. Need to know, he said flatly, and you don't. The exchange drew the attention of everyone in earshot. Mechanics paused mid-task, wrenches and rags hanging forgotten in their hands. Even the distant drone of the flight line seemed to fade beneath the weight of the standoff. Keating looked from one to the other. If this is going to happen, let's take it somewhere private. But the man in the coat shook his head. No point. Everyone here already saw too much today. She glanced around at the circle of eyes on them. The murmur from earlier had returned, only now it carried a sharper edge, anticipation mixed with unease. "What's this about?" she asked, not to the man but to Keating. The Major's answer was careful. "They say they need you elsewhere, somewhere that requires your particular background." The man in the coat added, "And before you ask, no, it's not optional." Silence hung between them for a beat too long. Then she reached down, unfastened the cuff of her sleeve, and rolled it just high enough for the patch to be fully visible. The red and black threads caught the light like an ember flaring back to life. "If you want me to walk away from this hangar," she said, "you'd better. Be sure the people you work for are ready for what that means." The man in the coat's jaw flexed, but he didn't answer. Instead, he gestured toward the Black Hawk. She took a step forward, then stopped beside Rourke. "You fly like you mean it," she said quietly. "Don't waste that." Before he could reply, she moved past him, the crowd parting instinctively as she headed for the waiting helicopter. The sound of the rotors swelled again as the crew inside prepared for takeoff. Keating and Rourke stood side by side, watching as she climbed aboard. The man in the coat followed, pulling the door shut behind them. A moment later, the Black Hawk lifted, banking away from the base until it was just a speck against the bright horizon. The hangar felt emptier than it should have. The crew drifted back to their work, but their focus was fractured. Tools clinked against metal without the usual rhythm. Conversation started and died halfway through. Rourke finally broke the quiet. "She's not coming back, is she?" Keating didn't answer right away. "If she does," he said at last, "it'll be because she decided to, not because anyone here went to get her." They both turned toward the Apache she'd worked on, its nose pointed toward the open hangar doors. The machine sat silent, but something about it carried the residue of the day's events, as if the air around it remembered more than it should. Outside, the faint hum of the Black Hawk faded completely, leaving only the wind moving across. The tarmac, cooler now, but carrying with it the sense that the real storm was still on its way. The interior of the Black Hawk was all hard edges and functional metal, a space built for utility rather than comfort. The low, steady vibration of the rotors traveled up through the deck plates, a reminder with every pulse that they were leaving the ground far behind. She sat on the portside bench, harness clipped in, helmet off, but headset in place. Across from her, the man in the field coat held onto an overhead strap with one hand, the other resting loosely on his knee. His mirrored glasses were gone now, tucked into a breast pocket, revealing eyes that were sharp but not unkind, though they gave nothing away. For a while, the only sounds were the deep thrum of the engines and the occasional clipped exchange between the pilots over the intercom. She watched the landscape unspool beneath them, the base shrinking to a cluster of concrete and asphalt, then giving way to dry scrubland streaked with the pale veins of dirt roads. Finally he spoke. "You haven't changed much." It wasn't a question, and it wasn't entirely a compliment. She kept her gaze out the open side door. "You have," she said evenly, a faint curve of his mouth gone almost as soon as it appeared. "We don't have much time before we land, so I'll skip the courtesies. They want you back in the loop. I'm out of the loop. That's the problem." Her eyes shifted to him, measuring. "And if I'm not interested?" He leaned forward slightly, voice pitched low enough that the crew up front wouldn't catch it. "Then they'll find someone less qualified. And when it goes sideways, which it will, you'll wish you'd been there." The helicopter banked slightly, and the view outside changed to rolling terrain, a patchwork of fields and abandoned structures. She recognized the contours of the land, though it had been years since she'd flown over it. "This isn't a debrief," she said. "This is a recall." He didn't deny it. "The situation's bad enough that even the brass who signed your discharge are pretending it never happened." She turned back to the horizon, letting the conversation hang. In the shifting light, the memories she'd kept locked away pressed closer. Flashes of a desert sky lit orange by. Tracer fire, the heavy smell of cordite. The clipped voices of people who'd trusted her to bring them home. The Black Hawk began its descent. Below, nestled between two low ridgelines, a compound came into view, its perimeter marked by high fencing, guard towers at each corner, and a landing zone cleared of everything but dust and concrete. The skids touched down with a muted bump. The side doors slid open, and the rush of hot air carried the sense of fuel and baked earth into the cabin. She unclipped her harness and stepped down, boots hitting the ground with the solid certainty of someone who knew how to plant herself in unfamiliar territory. The man in the coat followed, signaling to the crew chief before the helicopter lifted away again. Armed personnel in unmarked fatigues waited just beyond the edge of the landing zone. None of them wore insignia, but the way they carried themselves, balanced, economical, spoke volumes. These were not standard garrison troops. The man led her across the open ground toward a reinforced door set into the main building. Inside, the temperature dropped a few degrees, the air tinged with recycled ventilation. The corridors were narrow, the walls lined with soundproofing panels. They stopped outside a room with frosted glass, the only marking on the door a single number, 7. "Inside," he said. She stepped through into a briefing space no bigger than a supply closet. Just a table, 3 chairs, and a wall-mounted monitor currently dark. The door closed behind her with a muted click, and the sound of the outside world vanished. Another man was already seated at the table. He was older, hair silvered at the temples, his uniform devoid of name tape or rank, just like the others. But there was no mistaking the command in his posture. "Sit," he said. She did, without comment. He regarded her for a long moment. "We've been tracking a pattern in the last 6 months, incidents scattered across 3 regions, different players, same result, assets destroyed, crews lost. Every point of contact that should have connected the dots has either gone missing or stopped talking." She waited. He tapped a key, and the monitor on the wall came to life. Grainy aerial footage appeared, an armored convoy snaking through a canyon, then erupting in flame from a single precise strike. "Same signature each time," he continued, "same accuracy. We believe it's the work of a rogue cell operating off the grid, and we believe they've had inside help. Someone with the kind of operational knowledge you don't get from manuals." Her eyes stayed on the screen, but her jaw tightened fractionally. "You think it's one of ours?" "We think it's someone who was one of ours," he corrected. "And that's where you come in. No one else has the background to trace their methods without tipping them off." "I'm not in your chain of command anymore," she reminded him. "You're in mine for this," he said simply. The man in the coat had been leaning against the wall, silent until now. "You still have the skills. More importantly, you still have the instincts. You can walk away, But understand this, if you do, you'll be reading about the next strike in the casualty reports." The silence stretched. The hum of the ventilation filled the small room. Finally she spoke. "If I do this, I do it my way. No leash, no shadow, no one second-guessing me mid-op." The older man considered her for a long beat, then nodded once. "Agreed." "But you move fast, we've already lost time." She stood, her chair scraping softly against the floor. "Then we start now." As she reached the door, the man in the coat stepped aside to let her pass. "It's good to have you back," he said quietly. She didn't answer. Outside, the corridor stretched ahead, lined with more numbered doors. Somewhere behind one of them, the mission she hadn't asked for was already waiting to be unpacked. And she knew, even before she reached the end of the hall, that whatever this was, it was going to lead straight back into the shadows she'd walked away from. The corridor seemed longer than it should have been, its walls muted in color and stripped of anything that might catch the eye. She walked without hurry, yet her stride carried a quiet momentum, the kind that builds without needing to be forced. At the far end, a steel door waited. It was the kind of door that made you conscious of how solid the frame was, how little chance you'd have of forcing it from the outside. She pressed her palm to the scanner, a brief green light. Then the lock disengaged with a sound that was more felt than heard. Inside was a room unlike the one she'd just left. This space was larger, lit by recessed strips that left no shadows for the eye to cling to. Along one wall, a series of lockers stood open, each containing gear carefully laid. Out, body armor, helmets, night optics, weapons with their serial numbers filed off. A young quartermaster was waiting, tablet in hand. He didn't introduce himself, he just read from the display. "Your loadout's prepped. Specs match your file." She stepped past him, scanning the options. The rifle caught her attention first. Short barrel, suppressed, with the kind of balance you only get from a custom job. She hefted it, rolled her wrist once to check the feel, then set it down in favor of the sidearm. That, too, was a deliberate choice, lightweight, but with enough stopping power to matter. Her eyes moved to the armor. It was newer than what she'd worn in the past, but the lines were familiar. Ceramic, plates with a Kevlar weave designed to absorb punishment without slowing her down. She strapped in without assistance, adjusting the fit until it sat just right. The quartermaster hesitated, then held out a small object. "Command wanted you to have this." She took it, turning it over in her palm. It was a comm earpiece, but not standard issue. This one had encryption capability well beyond regular field gear. Sliding it into place, she caught her reflection in the dark lens of a storage case. For a fleeting moment, the woman looking back wasn't the mechanic, the hanger. Crew had known. She was something older, forged in a different fire. A voice crackled in her ear, testing the channel. "You're green on comms. Let's move." She followed the quartermaster through another door and into the open air. A vehicle idled nearby, matte black, no markings, the sort of machine you could park in a city street or a dirt trail without drawing too much attention. The man in the field coat was already in the passenger seat. He didn't speak as she climbed into the back, just gave a small nod to the driver. They rolled out of the compound, the tires whispering over gravel before gripping onto the packed dirt road. The ridgelines closed in around them, then fell away, revealing a stretch of badlands where the horizon blurred into heat. After a few minutes, he finally spoke. "Target's a relay point. They've been using it to move information without touching the open net. Our job's to intercept and confirm who's running it." "Confirm," she repeated. "Not shut down, for now. She let that settle. In her experience, for now was just a placeholder for until the politics change. The vehicle slowed as they approached a weathered bridge spanning a dry gully. On the far side, a narrow track wound into a cluster of low buildings that looked abandoned to anyone not looking closely. The driver parked in the shade of an outcrop, engine ticking softly in the heat. They moved on foot from there. The ground was a patchwork of stone and grit, the air so still it felt like the world was holding its breath. From a vantage point on a rocky ledge, she studied the buildings through binoculars. Faded paint peeled from the walls, windows clouded with dust, but there, the faintest shimmer of movement behind one pane, the glint of something metallic catching the light for just a heartbeat. She lowered the binoculars. 2 inside, maybe 3. Armed, the man in the coat adjusted his own optics. "That's our number. Your approach." She scanned the terrain again, mapping it in her mind. "We split. I go in from the south wall. There's a collapsed section I can use for cover. You hold north, cut off their escape." He didn't argue. They moved out, each taking their respective arcs. She kept low, the rifle balanced against her shoulder, her boots finding silent purchase on the uneven ground. At the breach in the wall, she paused, listening. Inside, voices spoke in a language she recognized but didn't understand fluently, enough to catch tone, not content. The rhythm was casual, almost bored. She slipped through the gap, the scent of dust and old wood thick in the air. The first man she saw was leaning against a table, weapons slung but safety off. His eyes flicked toward her an instant before she acted. The suppressed shot was more a cough than a bang. He went down without a sound, and she was already moving, sweeping the room for the next target. A second figure appeared in the doorway opposite, startled but fast. His rifle came up, but she was faster, sending a controlled pair into his center mass. She crossed the space, checked both bodies for comms devices. Nothing. That meant the third, if there was a third, had it. From the far room came the sound of a chair scraping back. She advanced, staying off the line of sight until she could slice the corner with her muzzle. The man inside was younger than the others, but his eyes were sharp with the kind of intelligence you can't fake. He froze when he saw her, weighing his options in the heartbeat before she spoke. "Comms, now." His gaze flicked toward the table beside him. She saw the movement and was on him before he could grab the device, twisting his arm up behind him and shoving him down onto the surface. The comm unit clattered free. She slid it toward herself, then tapped her earpiece. "Package secured." The man in the coat's voice came back immediately. "Copy. I'm on you." It took him less than a minute to appear in the doorway. He surveyed the scene without comment, then picked up the comm unit and slipped it into a protective pouch. "We're clear," he said. They retraced their steps to the breach, moving quickly now. Outside, the heat hit like a wall, but the air felt cleaner than the tension inside. Back at the vehicle, the driver was already in motion, swinging them around for the return trip. Halfway to the compound, the man in the coat broke the silence. "You still have it." She didn't ask what he meant. The road back to the compound was a ribbon of pale dirt cutting through a wide, empty expanse. The sky had that bleached quality of late afternoon, when the sun sits just low enough to throw hard angles across the terrain. She kept one arm braced against the seat as the vehicle bounced over a section of washboard ruts. The man in the coat leaned forward slightly, speaking to the driver without turning his head. "A just route. Take the western cut." She glanced sideways. "Why?" He didn't answer directly. Too many sight lines on the main approach. Her gaze flicked to the horizon. On the far ridge, a dark speck shifted, too deliberate to be wind or wildlife. She tracked it for a second longer before speaking. "We've got eyes on us." The driver's hands tightened fractionally on the wheel. "Stay steady," she said, almost casually. "They're gauging distance." The first shot came a heartbeat later, a sharp crack that punched through the air and took a chip out of the doorframe near her shoulder. The driver swung them hard left, tires throwing gravel into the roadside scrub. "Multiple shooters," she called, scanning the ridge. "At least 3 angles." The man in the coat pulled a compact SMG from under his seat, racking it with a smooth, economical motion. "We push through." "Negative," she countered, already unshouldering her rifle. "They've got the kill zone boxed in." She popped the door open before the vehicle had fully stopped, using the metal skin as partial cover while she swept her sights across the high ground. Another round hit the edge of the hood, showering her with tiny shards of paint. "2 o'clock, rock outcrop," she said, shifting position to force the shooter to adjust. The SMG chattered in short bursts as the man in the coat suppressed the flank. She timed her movement between his volleys, dropping to a knee and sending 2 measured shots into the ridgeline. One figure toppled, sliding a few feet before going still. The driver revved hard, fishtailing the vehicle to bring its armored side toward the threat. The smell of hot rubber and dust filled the air. "They're trying to pin us until the rest close in," she muttered, scanning for the others. A glint to the left, low near a cluster of thorn bush. She swung her barrel that way, squeezed, and the glint vanished. The man in the coat jerked his chin toward a narrow gully about 20 meters ahead. There, cover. They moved in quick bursts. Shoot, shift, move, until the nose of the vehicle dipped into the cut. The sudden drop in terrain muffled the incoming fire. "Not over," she said, her breathing steady but sharp-edged. "Never is," he replied. The gully twisted back toward the compound but forced them to slow, the walls tight enough to scrape the mirrors if the driver wasn't careful. That's when she caught the sound. Faint at first, then clearer. The low growl of an engine, not theirs. She tapped the side of the vehicle twice. Contact rear. The driver risked a glance in the mirror. A dark ATV was closing fast, 2 riders aboard, one holding a weapon braced on the roll bar. She turned in her seat, bracing herself against the frame. "Keep us straight." The rifle barked twice, the sound compressed by the gully walls. The gunner pitched sideways, weapon tumbling from his grasp. The driver of the ATV fought to keep control, but the machine swerved into the gully wall and flipped, vanishing in a cloud of dust. They didn't stop. When the compound finally came into view, the gate detail was already in motion, swinging the barrier open and waving them through. The second the vehicle rolled to a stop inside, she was out, scanning the perimeter. A quick head count confirmed what she already knew. Whoever had set the ambush wasn't acting alone. Someone had fed them the route. The man in the coat seemed to be thinking the same thing. They knew exactly where we'd be. Her eyes met his, which means they know what we took. He exhaled slowly. "And they'll come again." She slung the rifle over her shoulder, already mentally mapping the compound's vulnerabilities. The relay point's comm unit wasn't just a piece of gear, it was a thread, and now both ends were live. Above them, the light was fading, shadows lengthening along the inside of the walls. Somewhere beyond those walls, the rest of the cell was adjusting their plans, just as she was adjusting hers. Whatever happened next wouldn't wait for dawn. They didn't wait for the compound to settle. As soon as the vehicle was secured, she moved to the operations bay, where a long table glowed under a single overhead lamp. A satellite image of the surrounding terrain sprawled across its surface, annotated with grease. Pencil marks showing ingress routes, potential firing positions, and escape corridors. She leaned over the map, one hand braced against the table's edge, tracing the gully with her fingertip. They'll think we'll sit tight. That buys us one shot to reverse the angle." The man in the coat stood opposite her, arms folded. "You're talking about drawing them in. I'm talking about making them believe we're the ones pinned while we put a knife in their flank." He studied her for a moment, then gave a single nod. "What do you need?" She pointed to the narrow saddle west of the ridge. "That's their staging point. It's close enough to observe the compound, far enough to make them think they're invisible. We move there under blackout, set the net before they roll." Minutes later, she was suited in darker gear. Plates swapped for lighter composite panels, helmet fitted with low-light optics. The rifle was replaced with a suppressed carbine, tuned for maneuverability. A short combat blade rode high on her chest rig, within easy reach. They slipped out through a service gate, the night swallowing them whole. The desert air had cooled, bringing with it a dry sharpness that carried sound farther than during the day. Every step was placed with precision, weight shifting to avoid loose rock. By the time they reached the saddle, the moon had slid behind thin clouds, leaving the world painted in shades of charcoal and steel. She took a position just below the crest, the man in the coat settling opposite her with a clear line toward the gully. Through the optics, movement emerged, dark shapes peeling from the ridge, engines throttled low. They came in staggered, disciplined. This wasn't a ragged band of amateurs. The lead truck paused just shy of the saddle, headlights off, the faint glow of dash instruments painting the driver's hands. She keyed the mic twice, silent confirmation. The first two vehicles eased forward, the rest holding back. That was the tell. Scouts first, main body behind. She let them roll into the pocket, the sound of tires on gravel whispering through the stillness. Then she moved. Rising in one fluid motion, she dropped the first scout with a single, controlled burst, the suppressor turning the shot into a sharp exhale. The second dove for cover, but the man in the coat's SMG cut him down before he reached it. Engines roared as the rest of the convoy gunned forward, lights flaring, bullets sparked against the rocks where she'd been a moment before. She slid down the far side of the rise, using the slope to break their sightline, then angled hard right to come up on their exposed flank. A gunner popped up from the bed of the third truck, muzzle flashing in staccato bursts. She snapped 2 rounds into his silhouette, the rifle's recoil light against her shoulder, then shifted to the driver. The truck swerved, clipped the edge of the saddle, and rolled onto its side with a hollow crash. Over comms, the man in the coat's voice was taut. "More incoming. North cut." She swung her optics that way and caught the glint of fresh headlights cresting the ridge. Too many for a clean extraction. "Change of plan," she said, already moving downslope toward the wrecked truck. The overturned chassis offered partial cover and, more importantly, a higher vantage on the gully. She braced her rifle along the axle, breathing steady, watching the new vehicles fan out. The first of them crossed into the net. She took the shot, not at the lead, but at the second, snapping the formation and forcing the third to brake hard. The chaos cascaded backward, metal colliding with metal, shouts rising over the grind of gears. And then, from somewhere beyond the ridge, a sound she hadn't expected, the deep building chop of rotor blades. Not theirs, not friendly. She felt the vibration in her boots before she saw it. A helicopter, running dark, sliding low over the terrain. Its side door was open, and the shape inside was unmistakable, a mounted gun already swinging toward her position. Her comm flared with the man in the coat's voice, sharp now. "We're burned! Pull out!" But she didn't move. Not yet. Her eyes locked on the gunner in the open door, her finger tightening on the trigger. The world seemed to contract to that single line between them, the rotor wash whipping. the dust into a living wall, the roar of the engine folding over itself. And just as the gunner brought the weapon to bear, the night lit up. Understood. Here is part 6. Rewritten, extended approximately 2,000 words. Picking up at the instant the night exploded with light and carrying, through to a decisive, emotionally charged resolution, while keeping all language fresh and avoiding recycled phrasing from earlier parts. The night split open with a blade of brilliance that carved the darkness from ridge to ridge. The hostile helo's gunner flinched, aim kicking skyward as the beam knifed across his doorway and washed out his sight. She blinked through the glare, cheek pressed to the cool plane of the overturned truck, counting breaths until the afterimage burned away. It wasn't a random flare. The illumination tracked with deliberate grace, hunting the enemy aircraft with the patience of a predator. Another machine ghosted in from the west, sleeker, quicker, its skin mottled and low reflective, the sort of finish you give something you don't want noticed. No nav strobes, no unit paint, only intent. The hostile pilot tried to shake the light by rolling hard and dumping altitude. The newcomer matched every move, spotlight jittering, then pinning, then sliding off as both birds knifed along the contour of the ridge. Dust boiled off the slopes below them. For a heartbeat, the world became rotor thunder and white-hot glare. "Move," the man in the coat urged in her ear. Calm voice, tight edge. She broke from the wreck, staying low, towing quick angles through scrub, and rock until she hit the gully's lip and slid down its shadowed side. Fire from the scattered convoy licked the stones behind her. Chips of shattered granite pinged off her forearm guard. She pivoted behind a knuckle of basalt and looked up just in time to catch a stark outline. Painted in light on the newcomer's fuselage, a stylized wing slashed over a broken blade. Immediate recognition slammed through her chest, part warning, part ache. No time to stare. One of the remaining trucks fishtailed to block the exit toward the compound, engine whining under the strain. She sprinted along the gully's edge, ripped a grenade free, pulled, ring, and sent the small metal egg skittering under the chassis. A hard, concussive thump tore through the ground, flipping the vehicle onto its flank with a metallic howl. Voices cracked into curses. She didn't slow. The man in the coat popped into view behind a limestone shelf and leaned his SMG against the stone, sending disciplined bursts into the formation, trying to rally. She dove in beside him, dust clinging to her gear, breath threaded but steady. He flicked a fresh magazine toward her, thumb, arc, catch, without taking his eyes off the sights. "They're shaken," he said. "Then we end it," she replied, and rose into a controlled rhythm. Press, adjust, press again. Rubber shredded. Headlights blinked out. Engines coughed, stumbled, died. The fight bled out of the gully in ragged starts. What remained of the convoy broke into pockets. One group bolting for the north. Arroyo, another abandoning vehicles and dragging wounded behind a low rise. Above, the duel tightened. The Raven-marked helo slid across the hostile's tail and snapped the beam into the cockpit. The enemy swung wide to avoid the glare and overcorrected, rotor bite turning choppy as the pilot fought disorientation. The Allied bird didn't shoot, it herded, forcing the other crew to think. About not dying rather than about killing anyone on the ground. It was expert work, precise and merciless without being cruel. Silence fell in chunks, not all at once. First the ground fire tapered, then the last ricochets skipped, then only the two machines carved sound into the sky. When the hostile finally banked away for real, the Raven craft stayed glued. To its flank, until both were just darker shadows against a dark horizon. The beam blinked twice, acknowledgement, and died. "They'll be back," the man in the coat said, lowering his weapon. "Then we'll be ready," she answered, scanning the slope for movement that didn't belong. Nothing but smoke threads and the whimper of a failed radiator. They moved among the wrecks, stepping around dropped magazines and shattered glass. She kept the muzzle down but live, hand brushing the comm unit in her rig as if reminding herself it still existed. When they reached the truck she'd flipped earlier, a figure stirred under the blown door. She crouched, checked for a weapon, found a sidearm halfway under the man's hip. She kicked it aside and pulled the door just far enough to see his face, late 20s, dirt-smeared, blood sheeting from a scalp cut. His eyes tracked her hand more than her expression, predator math running behind the fear. "Medics inbound," the man in the coat said. "Interview later." She rose. "Later," she echoed, and started the walk out of the gully. The gate team saw them coming and rolled the barrier aside without questions. Floodlights snapped on along the interior wall, bathing the yard in hard white. Within that glare, every mark of tonight's work stood out, dust ground into their sleeves, grit in the lines. Of their plates, the specific stiffness of people who hadn't yet let their bodies believe it was over. In the ops room, Keating waited without theatrics. He didn't pace, he didn't posture. He just watched them cross the threshold and said, "Report." The man in the coat gave him the bones. Ambush on return, flanking maneuver, convoy broken, aerial. Contact from an unknown party, insignia consistent with a unit that officially did not exist. Details, Keating said, tone flat. He got them. When the retelling reached the part with the emblem, Keating's pupils pinched. He didn't bother asking if she was sure. He'd seen her recall in motion. He knew the difference between rumor and memory. "Sitrep on escort?" he asked. "Shadowed the hostile until both cleared the ridge," the man in the coat replied. "No landing, no hail." Keating nodded like a man promising himself he'd swallow the rest of his questions for now. "Get cleaned up. Hours sleep if you can steal it. Debrief at first light." She didn't argue. Exhaustion had crept in at the edges, not dramatic, just insistent, like pebbles in a boot. In the barracks, she locked the door, stripped the carbine, wiped each component until it clicked like new. The act quieted the leftover adrenaline, let her mind unspool the puzzle without snagging. A squadron thought erased was still flying. Not just flying, choosing when to appear and who to save. That was a message. Maybe it read, "You're not alone." Maybe it read, "Watch where you step." She reassembled the rifle by feel, set it within reach, and let her shoulders sink for 30 measured breaths. Then came the knock. "Open," she said. The man in the coat slipped in and nudged the door with his heel until the latch clicked. He held up the comm unit they'd seized, wiped down but still bearing the worn edges of too many hands. "We crack it now," he said, not asking permission. They took it to a narrow room off the corridor, just big enough for a table and 2 folding chairs. The overhead glowed dim, as if the building had decided not to give them more than they needed. She fed the unit power from a field brick, coaxed it past a tripwire that would have nuked the data if they'd been clumsy, and pulled up the index. What spilled out wasn't a trove, it was a needle map. Each point corresponded to an action across months, strikes on depots, precision, raids on comms heads, exfil corridors snapped shut just as someone tried to run. Threads connected the points like taut wire. On that web, a silhouette repeated, helmet off in one frame, chin tilted, posture compact and coiled even at rest. Familiar in a way that made her chest tighten. He saw her see it. "Who?" She didn't answer, not yet. She scrubbed the audio channel instead. Voices cut through static, languages flipping, code phrases like smooth stones turned in a palm. Twice she heard a cadence that tugged at an old part of her brain, someone who delivered urgency without heat, as if calm itself were a weapon. "Not rogue," she said finally. "Selective, surgical. They're cutting away what ties back to something neither side can admit exists." She tapped the newest pin on the map, and we were sent to trip an alarm on their perimeter. He leaned back against the wall, letting that settle. "If our leash holders want you pointed at them, either they don't know who they are, or they do. Both are bad," she said. He half smiled, not from humor. "Then we choose our own line." "Not yet." She folded the unit shut, and the little room sank into ordinary air again. "First, we confirm the pilot." "You recognized them," he said, not accusing. "I recognized a way of moving," she corrected. "And an emblem you don't wear unless you bled for it." He accepted the deflection with a small nod. "Sleep while you can." She didn't. She took her hour and turned it into a shower, a fresh shirt, a hot cup that barely tasted of coffee but counted as ritual. Before dawn bled color into the eastern edge of the world, she stood on the roof, elbows on the parapet, watching the compound breathe. A stray cat threaded its way along the warm bricks, tail flagging like a signal. Somewhere down in the yard, a young sentry fought a losing battle with a yawn. Behind her, footsteps approached. Keating joined her without greeting. For a time, they stared at the same nothing. "You've seen that mark before," he said finally. "Yes. You going to tell me where?" "No." He didn't bristle. He took it like he took everything. Weighed, filed, retained. "They're sending a liaison," he said. "Claims to be from a place that doesn't issue liaisons." She looked at him. "Meaning?" "Meaning we're about to get polite pressure, the kind that comes with sealed envelopes and long names." "I prefer rotor wash," she said dryly. "I prefer not needing either." He straightened. "Debrief in 10. The room filled quickly. Driver, gate sergeant, 2 medics, the comms specialist. The man in the coat near the back with his arms folded loosely. She gave them the night, stripped of decoration, just the bones that mattered and the tendons that held them. Questions came in short bursts and got shorter answers. When someone asked about the Allied helo's origin, she said, "Classified." Keating let it pass. When the door opened mid-sentence and the liaison walked in, no one had to ask who he was. The uniform fit without belonging. The face was official without being known. He carried authority like a quiet cologne. "Carry on," he said mildly, and sat. Eyes tracked him, then tracked her. She finished the synopsis and set the comm unit on the table. He didn't look at it. His eyes flicked to her sleeve. Quick, sharp, gone in an instant, as if the glance itself carried more weight than words. Blink and miss, and then it was over. He straightened, masking whatever passed through his mind with a well-educated smile that could mean anything. On behalf of concerned parties, he said, "Thank you for your service. We'd like the device." The words were polite. The cadence was a door that didn't expect to be locked. She slid a fraction of an inch to put her hand on the unit. "Chain of custody remains with us until we finish our analysis." "Of course," he said, with a tone that suggested the opposite. "Still, expediency gets people killed when it outruns understanding," she finished, matching his soft edges with firmer ones. The man in the coat didn't shift. Keating didn't cough. The room held the kind of still that comes when a line is being drawn with a hair. The liaison set a folder on the table. No markings. He tapped it once. "In that case, perhaps this clarifies your scope. She didn't reach for it. If you brought a scope, you brought a target." For the first time, something real flickered behind his eyes. Not annoyance, calculation. He withdrew his hand from the folder and laced his fingers together. You're looking for someone, even if you won't say so. So are we. The difference is that we'd like to find them before our mutual adversaries do. Define mutual, the man in the coat said, speaking up for the first time. The liaison let the pause sit just long enough to feel intentional. A malign network with assets in places both of our employers pretend don't exist. You cut a convoy last night that belonged to one of their feeders. Good. Now we step beyond feeders. She tilted her head, the slightest acknowledgement. And a helo? What helo? He asked, bland. Keating almost smiled. Almost. We'll revert with analysis, he said, stepping into the gap. Until then, the unit stays here. The liaison stood with the kind of unhurried grace that irritated people who lived in the field. Very well, he said. You know where to find me. He did not say where that was. He left without the folder. Keating didn't move to take it, neither did the man in the coat. She picked it up last, broke the seal, and slid out a single photograph. Blown up from drone footage, clean just enough to be legible. A person in the door of a helicopter, half turned, mouth set, eyes covered. By goggles, hair pinned back, in a way she remembered from a different life. The bird carried the same mark, no comment needed. There was a note scribbled at the bottom in a hand she recognized even. Through the scanner distortion, stop chasing the wrong ghosts. She didn't realize she'd tightened her grip until the corner creased. The man in the coat saw it but said nothing. Keating watched both of them and saw enough to know he didn't need the rest. She slid the photo back into the folder, closed it, and spoke to the room, not to the note. We're moving tonight. The comm data points to a relay 5 clicks east. Quiet farm ruins, good radio. Horizon, enough cover to park 2 trucks and a motorcycle twice over. It's not the head, it's a hand. We take the hand and see which shoulder it's attached to. Keating nodded once. You lead. The day stretched, thin and brittle, over preparations. Maps were marked, routes memorized, contingencies hung like coats on pegs, one for weather, one for a wrong turn, one for everything smarter opponents might do. She checked every magazine by touch, not sight. She ate something forgettable on purpose. She stood once more on the roof and watched a hawk circle the thermals until it became a dot and then air. Night slid down clean. They rolled out in 2 vehicles under a sky that looked polished. She took the second seat in the lead truck, head tilted to catch changes in the road's grammar. Gravel to hardpan to a wash crossing to the faint drumming of an old culvert under the tires. The farm ruin materialized as a loose geometry of broken walls and an upright water tower that had no water left to hold. They parked in shadow and fanned out. The ruin wasn't empty. 2 figures, one on the collapsed porch, one in the shadow of a tractor skeleton, moved with the coiled ease of people accustomed to being hunted. She watched their arcs, found the seam, and slipped through it. The porch sentry never saw her. The second managed to raise a hand, and then thought better of it when she set the edge of her blade under his ear and said no, so softly it might have been a kindness. Inside the main room, a radio stack hummed with life, lights winking in. Sequences that told her the operator knew exactly what he was doing. He looked up when she stepped in. He did not reach for a weapon. He reached for a switch and cut power so fast the dials spun past 0 and back again. Too late, he said, a wryness to it that belonged to someone who understood defeat without surrender. She didn't threaten. Who do you answer to? Same people you used to, he said, and smiled just enough to acknowledge the sting. Boots in the yard, announced the man in the coat. He swept the corners, relaxed fractionally when none of the corners looked back. The operator offered him a seat with an open hand. No one sat. "What now?" the operator asked her, as if she were the only one in the room whose answer mattered. "Now," she said, "you call your ride." He tapped an inactive switch, amused. "You just saw me turn it off." "Not that ride," she said, and looked up through the ragged hole where a roof used to be. They all heard it at the same time, a low, familiar thrum building from the east. The water tower caught the first breath of downdraft and shivered like a tuning fork. The helicopter slid into view without lights, a silhouette cut from the same cloth as the one that had saved her skin the night before. It hung above the ruin, wind whipping grit into their faces, and then it eased sideways so a rope could drop into the gap. A figure came down hand over hand, easy and exact. Boots hit broken tile, goggles lifted. The face beneath them was older than the last time she'd seen it, and somehow exactly the same. "Hello, 01, the newcomer said, voice warm and level in a way that made the old world fold over the new without a seam. Her throat tightened and released. "You should have landed last night." "You didn't need me to," the pilot said. A glance took in the radio stack, the operator, the man in the coat, the door, the yard, the night beyond. Calculation without cruelty. We're on the same side of a ledger none of them are allowed to read. The man in the coat didn't bristle, didn't posture. He studied this piece of living history and asked the simplest question. "Proof?" The pilot drew a pouch from her jacket and set it on the dead radio. "Coordinates, times, names they won't miss until it's too late. While they plan, we clear the board. Why show your face? You're the only one I trust to turn miracles into checklists." She took the pouch, heavier than it looked. "After this, we vanish," the pilot said. "I won't need another rope." The bird lifted, fading into the night. She turned to the man in the coat. "We finish this our way." Back at the compound, she crossed the threshold certain again. A small sign started it, the work would finish it. And between rotor beats, she'd claimed the sky as hers. Some battles are fought in daylight for all to see. Others happen in shadows, where names vanish and victories have no witnesses. She walked back into that hangar a mechanic, and left it a legend, reborn, carrying the weight of a squadron the world believed dead. If her story moved you, share it. If you ride with us in these unseen wars, subscribe to Veteran Biker and be part of the next mission. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done in her place? Until next time, keep your eyes sharp and your spirit unshaken.